today. Good afternoon and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is George Tatar from the Budapest Center for Dialogue and Mass Atrocities Prevention. My organization several months ago opened an online space for posting information with regard to the culture of dialogue, its dissemination and development of international capabilities. In that context, we also launched a series of interviews with scholars and practitioners where, in the spirit of dialogue, they could express their views on various aspects and contemporary challenges of mass atrocities prevention, including the implementation of the principle of the responsibility to protect. We assume that such a joint reflection would help explore the obstacles which impede the effective translation of the principle into practice, and we could, through this specific dialogue process, contribute to the implementation and operationalization of the responsibility to protect. Our first interview guest was Dr. István Lakatos, the Human Rights Ambassador of Hungary, who, based on his diplomatic career and his practice, he talked about the conflict between universal human rights and values and the cultural relativism. And in his interview, he explained that the religious and cultural norms of all important civilizations, cultures, religions can be reconciled, of course, to some within certain limits, with the international human rights standards. So you may find his interview on our website, and if you wish, you can also read his book, which he published just recently under the title "Comparative Human Rights Diplomacy in the Shadow of Cultural Relativism and Clash of Civilization." After the practitioner, after the ambassador, Mr. István Lakatos, this time we shall ask about the views of a scholar, of a young researcher, Mr. Thomas Peake. Hi, Thomas. Welcome in our circle. Thomas got his degree in Oxford University. He was a visiting PhD student in Cambridge, and then received his PhD title in Budapest in the Central European University. That was located that time in Budapest. Now he was forced to leave Budapest and move to Vienna, unfortunately. So we learned each other in Budapest, and he has also helped us our activities in the center. Then for some years, I'm grateful for that, Tom. After some years, Tom spent in the Center for Geopolitics of the Cambridge University. Now he is a researcher in the Institute of International Relations and Political Science in the University of Vilnius. And he has published a book 1 year ago under the title "Westphalia from Below: Humanitarian Intervention and the Myth of 1648." Then in his recent articles, he handles with challenges of R2P, particularly with the issues of humanitarian intervention and the impacts of the post-liberal era on the implementation of the responsibility to protect. So, good afternoon, Tom. Today, we shall together with my colleague Gary, whom I'm very happy to introduce as the senior faculty research fellow of the Budapest Center, who is actually an associate professor in the University of Tennessee Department of Political Science. And from his very rich and fruitful scientific activities, I wanted to highlight only the topics of genocide and politicized. Sorry if I am a bit limiting your activities, Gary. And the UN peacekeeping missions, he published a lot of articles on that. And also, I wanted to underline his analysis of international interventions into atrocity situations. So welcome on board, Gary. Today, we shall ask then Thomas about how he sees and evaluates the challenges which the supporters of the responsibility to protect should address in the shaping multipolar world, and which some call right now as the post-liberal world order. And my first question would be to Tom, how is the context for R2P implementation likely to change? So how you see the geopolitical changes and the development of this multipolar world, where which is with its revitalized sovereignty perception, with the paralyzed UN Security Council, with the perpetration of the R2P crimes by two permanent members of the UN Security Council, namely Russia and China, how these all affect the discourse around R2P and its implementation. Sorry if I was a bit long with my introduction, but that was necessary to do given these two scholars in this conversation. So, Tom, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for organising this, and great to be. We spent many happy years as colleagues at the Budapest Center, so it's good to be able to come back and speak in this context. So yes, you've mentioned that we're, this concept of the post-liberal international order, which is essentially is a shorthand for many of these extreme challenges that human rights regime, that principles of multilateral governance, etc., are facing, characterized primarily by two major trends. The first of which would be the broader global diffusion of power, which includes a diffusion of power towards more authoritarian states who focus more on principles, on statist principles, and of course also the rise of populist nationalist movements within the core states of the liberal order itself. And this trend, and of course, this trend has exacerbated many existing challenges. So even, of course, we had the Security Council authorized intervention in Libya, but that's always been an exception. That's the only time that's happened. So the Security Council, unfortunately, has been experiencing various forms of paralysis, it seems to me, even during the kind of the height of liberal order. And yes, R2P is certainly implicated in these challenges more strongly than many other aspects of international order, simply because of the fact that it at least seemingly threatens sovereignty to a high degree. Of course, other aspects of the international protection regime are also being contested, including UN peacekeeping and the International Criminal Court. And I think a really interesting comment on this was made by Michael Ignatieff, who essentially, I think last year or the year before, wrote an article where he kind of acknowledged some of the implicit assumptions that had gone into the construction of R2P and which had been taken for granted, just to be kind of natural features of the international environment, but which are no longer hold true. The first of which was that the United States would be able to continue to exert leadership and under extreme circumstances would be able to marshal or gather coalitions of states to intervene in R2P relevant situations in extremis. The second is that, again, under very extreme circumstances, the Security Council, in the end, with of course the rare, with the specific exceptions, but the Security Council is never going to penalise either a permanent member or a core ally of a permanent member. But beyond this, the Security Council would, in certain circumstances, be able to function properly and to respond to crisis situations, including the authorization of military intervention. And third, that domestic populations, at least in liberal democratic societies, would have at least a base level of a consensus around human rights and around the global protection or promotion of human rights, and in extreme circumstances, again, would be prepared to act coercively to address massive abuses such as genocide. And as Ignatieff has acknowledged, all three of these assumptions absolutely no longer hold. And so really, it seems that we're in a situation with R2P which is completely divorced from the situation of its kind of founding moment. And so it seems that it's important, it's much more important now than it was several years ago to acknowledge the challenges, to acknowledge the divergent perspectives and the differing opinions on R2P, and to seriously engage with them, and to really seek to almost relocate a consensus. And I think one helpful way of approaching this is not approaching it in terms of supportive or critical states of R2P, or states who are for or against R2P, but rather to look at it as a situation where we have an increasingly globalized international community which needs to continue to work to form consensus on this very, very important issue.
Thank you, Tom. If I could just follow up briefly and ask you, you mentioned that one of the key trends that we're seeing is this global diffusion of power towards authoritarian states like Russia, like China, and this has led to contestation of R2P, peacekeeping, and these other international actions. And yet we sometimes do see states like China taking a greater role in peacekeeping at the same time as that they're contesting other ideas. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to us about what makes R2P perhaps unique from the perspective of countries like China or Russia relative to these other international actions, and why this might be the primary target of the contestation rather than something like peacekeeping.
Yes, I think one of the things that makes R2P special in this sense is the residual concern with at least the possibility of military intervention or coercive force. So many of these other, most of the tools of the international human rights regime rest on principles of consent. For example, peacekeeping, and of course the first two pillars of the R2P also kind of lean towards this consensual approach. But perhaps, well, you could look at it from two ways, and I suppose it could be both of these could be true in different contexts. On the one hand, you could have a genuine principled concern for state sovereignty, right? So states could, particularly post-colonial states, could have a very legitimate reason for for articulating a strong defense of sovereignty, which might imply a more hesitant approach to how the R2P has been currently articulated. Or, of course, a more cynical view would be to look at this this sovereignty issue as a kind of a smokescreen, right? To facilitate a broader contestation of the principle. And I suppose this could also be true to lesser degrees, perhaps in relation to other aspects of the human protection regime, but perhaps R2P is where we find it at its sharpest.
Thank you very much, Tom, for your first rather detailed response. So the next point, what definitely we need to discuss is about this the normative content of contestation, what you have already mentioned around R2P. So could you mention maybe some concrete issues why some states in the global south disagree with R2P, and therefore they decline to join it? So we know that there are several, numerous, and it would be, of course, much better if the camp of supporters would become bigger.
Yes, sure. I mean, just the first thing, I would maybe lean back from again, from kind of saying we have necessarily kind of supportive or critical states, right? I think there's very few states outright reject the principle of R2P entirely. Of course, there are, I mean, North Korea, right, for example. But I think in general, what we see is rather a contestation over what R2P means. And I think some of these just to take several examples. So first of all, we find in the thematic debates, for example, many states express extreme reticence about the institutionalization of R2P at the UN. And this also includes some states who voted last year in favor of having the annual debates at the UN. Of course, this was heralded, this vote was heralded as a great success by many advocates in civil society. But if you look at how many states framed their, or some states framed even their votes in support among skeptical states, it was in order to challenge the content of R2P. It was in order to bring it to a discussion so that actually we can often they'll use a phrase such as reach a consensus. Second, many states reject the language of atrocity crimes and even the idea of atrocity crimes as such. We hear many states referring to this as a kind of a politicized language, which isn't explicitly outlined in international law, for example. Third, we have a contestation around what we mean by prevention. So that you could say the greatest aspect of agreement amongst states of all different persuasions and regional regional origin is a focus on prevention. Everybody agrees that prevention should be the primary component of the responsibility to protect. However, we see many states disputing the dominant liberal narrative about what causes atrocity crimes, and they highlight structural issues and specific practices of the liberal order and its core states, which they argue are neglected in quote-unquote political documents, such as the UN Office of the Special Advisor for Prevention of Genocide Framework for Atrocity Crimes, for instance. So Egypt, for example, who have been named as a R2P champion by some Western scholars, call for the rejection of that document, for example, as a political political document. So we have an agreement on the primacy of prevention, but we have contestation around what causes atrocity crimes and therefore what we mean by prevention. And many states in the global south would say there are many things which the West or the core states of the liberal order need to stop doing before we begin to look at some of the more intrusive practices. And then finally, many states continue, and this is, of course, for those R2P scholars and students out there, this will be a familiar one. States continue to contest the three-pillar structure and argue that the pillars are strictly sequential, which is obviously odds with how R2P is imagined and practiced in what we can call the liberal states. So those would be a few kind of broad basket examples of where we have concrete contestation in the international community.
So, Tom, you raised this interesting idea here that it's more of a distribution of dissatisfaction or support with R2P rather than pure rejection or acceptance. In your mind, what does that distribution look like? Are most states, if we were to think about this as a continuum from full support to full rejection, do they fit, mostly along the line of acceptance? Are they right around 50-50? Are they towards the rejection? How do you see this? If we were to think about all member states, for example.
I suppose it would depend what we're talking about, right? So if we're talking about accepting the principle of responsibility to protect as it's kind of stated in the World Summit Outcome document, that atrocity crimes, or they wouldn't, of course, like that language, many of them, genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing are impermissible, and that under certain circumstances, when they occur, they are the international community has a kind of a last resort responsibility to those populations. I would say that's overwhelming support. Very, very few states contest that fundamental idea. I would probably say no states contest that really basic idea of the responsibility to protect. And even when states are expressing more critical views, they will usually preface these critical views by saying, of course, we know that genocide, ethnic cleansing, etc., are illegitimate, etc., etc. So on that kind of broad spectrum, there's a really, on that narrow, line, there's a really strong level of support. But I think it kind of diverges from being like a straight line where you have rejection and acceptance, and it becomes like a spectrum where states interpret things differently, right? And states contest oftentimes the content of R2P as it's been elaborated primarily within the Western, the liberal framework over the last 15 years or so.
Thank you very much, Tom. That's very, very interesting, and I think it's very important that we also take into account those ideas and those views, those positions which are not full-heartedly support the implementation and operationalization of R2P. My probably last question would be about this, obviously in the context of dialogue. So is this contestation what you mentioned? You also probably mentioned restricted to Pillar 3 only, but what can how can states constructively engage with this contestation? So would the generation of a dialogue process between practitioners and scholars, so the so-called who are the R2P opposing and supporting states, help address these challenges you mentioned, and also just probably you also have seen the interview of István. So he also spoke about the tensions between the universal human rights values and the local habits, and mentioned in his interview. So what do you think about the significance and perspective of dialogue in that respect?
I mean, I think that's really, really important. And I think, viewpoints, or states or viewpoints, or however it would be articulated, speaking to each other rather than speaking past each other or speaking about each other, would be a really important way to move forward. I suppose there would be severe challenges related specifically to the Security Council members at the moment. So I wonder whether even such a dialogue might even be more fruitful from outside the Security Council, outside the permanent members. I think it's imperative if the R2P is going to flourish and is going to be really fit for purpose in this radically different international context, then I think process of ongoing dialogue to kind of reaffirm and deepen elements where there are consensus, and to find consensus on these other points is essential. And I think this might involve some serious concessions, right, from the dominant kind of liberal perspective, perhaps some serious concessions to alternative perspectives on how and what the R2P can be. But I think the work that civil society organizations like yourselves are doing are far more important now than they even were 5 years ago in this respect.
So Tom, if I could, just two questions that are related here. So the first is, how far are we from that endpoint? And the second is, if part of getting towards agreement on the concept of R2P or Pillar 3 and specifically, what type of concessions do you think would be most pressing or most likely to bring us closer to a point of agreement on these topics?
Yeah, they're excellent questions. And sorry, I feel like I keep kind of, twisting your questions before I give an answer. But I don't know if there is an end point as such, right? I think these things are always processes which are constantly being contested, constantly being reimagined, reconstructed over time. But I think that to really deepen the consensus, at least in kind of an immediate short-term level, might mean serious concessions, perhaps even over things such as the three-pillar structure. I mean, I've had a kind of a bit of a heretical thought that maybe it should be a four-pillar structure, perhaps, where you really do explicitly separate military intervention from all of the other Pillar 3 tools, or expanding the concept of atrocity crimes to include things such as aggression, the crime of aggression, which is an idea put forward by several states. And it might even involve the core members of the liberal order being held to account in a much more rigorous fashion than they often are over their own inconsistencies, right? Their own practices and their support for certain states who are committing atrocity crimes, essentially, at the same time as trying to uphold this universal commitment. So yeah, it's a really broad and open-ended question. And as I said, I think that the most important thing is to speak and is to work towards some kind of evolving some kind of evolving agreement that everybody feels they have ownership over, because that's the main problem at the moment, is that many states, or probably the majority of the world states, don't feel as if they have ownership over things such as the R2P. And I think that the broader this sense of ownership can become in international society through dialogue, through the evolution of these established ways of doing things, the better.
So thank you very much, Tom, for your precious time, and also Gary for your questions to the point. I'm very thankful grateful for this thought-provoking, further thoughts-provoking responses of Tom. I do think so that we need to think and to reflect on these topics, on these issues. So the Budapest Center wishes to provide space for such interviews, for such talks, discussions also in the future. For the time being, we stop this process, and we do plan that we shall continue it after the holidays. So in the first half of January, again, we shall maybe start. Well, we shall see whether a practitioner or scholar. It depends. We shall have to discuss it. What would be the best? But with this forward-looking and constructive approach, we would like to further contribute to the implementation of the responsibility to protect. So thank you both for the conversation, for your presence, and I wish you and also the others who will watch this interview nice holidays and good relaxing in the end of the year. Thank you very much, Tom. All the best.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you both.